I'll tell you the story of the genesis of the book from my point of view, really. It was never ever my intention to set about to write this. It arose out of regular messages, emails and blog posts that I used to send back home from my various trips to Chitokoloke. Apart from one trip which I did with Jenny, and she had done one independently of me as well, I generally travelled to Zambia on my own. My wife Christine, not a great fan of wildlife in any shape or form, and never keen on the idea of creepy crawlies. And anyway, she had loads of other activities and responsibilities at home, and so at the end of each day I would typically just sit down with the computer and write down some of the events, often the almost unbelievable events that took place pretty much on a daily basis. And then after several years and several visits, I realised that I had more than enough material to adapt into a more accessible narrative, and so Controlled Chaos is the result of that. So the chapters actually really just set out to give a picture of a day in the life of the mission or the mission partners in Chitokoloke. And it's my purpose today, this evening, to give you a bit of a rapid-fire introduction to the place, to the people, and to the content that we've tried to capture in the book. So in order to do that, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few pictures just to give you, I hope, a bit of a flavour of what Chitokoloke is like. When you think of Zambia, you probably think of wildlife, you think of vast savannas, incredible scenery. It is, of course, the location of the smoke that thunders, also known as the Victoria Falls. Not the highest or the widest, but still classified as the largest waterfall in the world by dint of its combined width of about 1,700 metres and its depth of about 100 metres. Zambia, according to the World Bank, ranks among the countries with the highest levels of poverty in the world. Some 58% of its 16.5 million people earn less than the international poverty line of $1.90 US per day. Chitokoloke is indicated on the map there, on the northwestern province of the country. Now, about 3/4 of the poor people live in rural areas rather than in towns or cities. And this image shows you the same river that cascades over the Victoria Falls at Livingston. But here, hundreds of miles upstream, is a tranquil, beautiful river. But as we'll see, it's also potentially deadly. Now, experience in rural Africa presents the Western traveller with no end of contrasts. Transportation for me from Glasgow was by means of a luxurious Emirates 777-300 to Lusaka. And then in Lusaka I transferred, in contrast, to my onward connection to Chitokoloke International Airport, and that was by means of this beast, Charlie Tango Oscar, the Chitokoloke mission plane, a Cessna 206. And instead of sitting away back in the wide-bodied jet, you have a seat right beside the pilot, but not before he has a look under the bonnet, or the hood as our US cousins like to call it, perhaps a little disconcerting for some. That's Chris Brundage, all the way from Thunder Bay in northern Canada, and he is the pilot stationed at Chitokoloke at the moment. Soon we're in the air, all is well, and after about 3 hours of cruising, we finally reach the vicinity of Chitokoloke. And if I can demonstrate with my mouse, and you can hopefully see this image, right at the top there, as indicated by the arrow, is the airstrip. Just above it, you can barely see it through the mist or the haze, is the Zambezi River. And these buildings a little bit closer to the foreground are the hospital and the surrounding buildings. When you can see what the local vicinity is like, these are the typical African dwellings in the bush, very basic primitive houses. And many of them, and here's the plane coming into land, are very close to the airstrip. And so when the plane arrives, it always attracts a great deal of local interest, and the crowds come out to see what on earth is going on. This image shows you what the hospital looks like, or looked like rather, from the air. This is taken at a time of year when everything is green and fertile. On my first trip there in 2015, I arrived in October of that year, and pretty much all the vegetation was burnt to a crisp. But let me just introduce you to a few of the characters and the personnel who make this place so special. Here are David and Lorraine McAdam. David is often the only doctor for the entire hospital and is keen to take help from other specialists from time to time. But he essentially looks after all the specialty care, the surgery, the anaesthetics, obstetrics, neonatal care, including any subspecialty you care to name: urology, gynecology, internal medicine, ophthalmology. I can honestly say I've never encountered a clinician with such a breadth of clinical skill and experience. Truly remarkable, and indeed I think unparalleled in the Western world. Lorraine too is an accomplished multitasker, as you can imagine. A senior nurse herself and a midwife in her own right, she's heavily involved in the hospital work and in many of the other mission activities. Here's another character. This is Dr. Mwansa. You'll hear more about Mwansa from Jenny shortly. But Mwansa spent about 4 years in Chit. She's a Zambian by birth and is currently actually working in Glasgow in a job in paediatric gastroenterology. Her medical training was from Beijing, strangely enough, and her teaching was all in Chinese. Quite remarkable. But she was a tremendous asset in Chitokoloki, capable of dealing with surgical emergencies and all manner of other patient-related problems that arose. As well as the medical staff, there are several expat nurses. This is Caitlin Spicinger. She is based in Chit with her husband Joey and their 3 small children. Joey is the aircraft mechanic, looks after the plane, and actually looks after just about every other mechanical maintenance or repair task that might be required. And then there are some local chaps. They are 2 likely lads. This on the left is John Chalanda, and on the right, Kayumbo. Both of them feature in the book, and both of them are trained really to work in the hospital. They have various responsibilities. I took this picture when they were taking supplies to the aircraft to sustain a day's operating at Chivuma Mission Hospital that some of you will have heard of, just a short flight away. And here's just a collection of images featuring Jenny and some of the local staff there. You can see the nurse that she's with is called Wamba. There's Kayumbo and Chalanda again, and Jenny with a couple of her small patients. When I arrived in Chitokoloki for the first time, I was struck by the beauty of the place. It's on an incredible spot high on the plain above the Zambezi. And you'll notice from this image under the African flame tree in glorious bloom what appear to be a series of headstones and memorials to various mission staff members who have died or who've been killed over the years. A very poignant place. One in particular you may recall because it made international headlines in the summer of 2012 when Jay and Katrina Eriksson were killed. Their plane came down in the river. They lost their lives and their 2 little children were left orphaned. Just an example of the risks and the sacrifice that sometimes attends missionary service in the developing world. When I got there for the first time, Chris took me around the entire site, which is about a square kilometre, and just beyond. What you find is similar characteristics, moving around the villages, loads of children everywhere who are anxious to get into the image that you're taking with your camera. Look at these kids here, just as happy as can be, but you get a real sense of the poverty from a picture like this. Few, if any of them, have any kind of shoes, and they're dressed, as you can see, in rags. And they live in flimsy houses, buildings mostly made of straw, some with thatched roofs, most with thatched roofs, some with tin roofs, some actually made of some of the local brick, but many of them very rudimentary buildings, as you can see. And look at this, the yellow plastic cans scattered all around. These are used for transporting the family water supply from the river, or perhaps from a local borehole. And you can see here that some of the houses are actually a bit more substantial, made of brick, but again with a thatched roof. Down by the river, I came across these men who were heaving the clay bricks that they'd carved out of the ground, taking them over to a kiln that they were building. There's Chris speaking to some of the guys building the kiln, and they light the fires inside these tunnels and they bake the bricks so that they're ready for building. Now, I could show you many pictures. We don't have time for all that many, but one of the overriding features about the people who live in the communities around Chitokoloki is their cheerfulness and their resilience and their fortitude. They're a lovely, welcoming people. Notice here, no need for buggies or strollers or baby carriages or kitchens. What kitchen? Here is food preparation. This is nshima being prepared al fresco style. And in the grounds of the old hospital, the hospital that James Caldwell would have known, here they are preparing to cook outdoors, retrieving water from a local borehole. The new hospital that you saw from the air a few moments ago is reasonably well equipped considering. And when you arrive there at the main entrance, you'll meet someone like this. This is Frank. He is a security guard and he takes no nonsense, I can tell you. And as you get inside, this is the kind of view that you might be met by in the male ward. Densely populated, as you can see. Note the mosquito nets hanging there. The patients and various family members and their carers are there. And look at the mattresses you can just see on the floor. They serve as extra beds. And just round the corner there's a queue for the outpatient clinic. All these patients are waiting sometimes for the better part of an entire day in the heat, holding their blue medical records. Life there is simple, but it's certainly not trouble-free by any stretch of the imagination. What CHIT does provide, however, is Western-style, free healthcare in a hospital that actually attracts patients from many hundreds of miles around, many of them arriving on foot or by ox cart. This is a picture of someone's back, but despite the free service and the advanced Western medicine and surgery that's available, the local traditional healers who make marks like this in people's skin, the witch doctors, still hold the population under their malign influence. Many patients, some detailed in the book, suffer permanent damage such as blindness or worse as a result of their ministrations. So what about the dangers that we know little about? There are some specific dangers that we just don't experience in the UK or the USA. Malaria is one. Here's a picture of an Anopheles mosquito, responsible through malaria for about 1.5 million deaths worldwide every year. Here's a character you may not have ever seen before. This is a hugely enlarged view of a little freshwater fluke that causes untold damage in rural Africa. This is Schistosoma mansoni, named after a Scotsman, interestingly enough. This is the cause of a disease called bilharzia, which is absolutely rife in that part of the world. More obvious and more terrifying, although maybe in public health terms not so damaging, the apex predator whose territory is the river is this character, the Nile crocodile. And in the book you'll find many examples of patients that we looked after. There can be few Glasgow surgeons who have anything like the experience that I've managed to garner there of dealing with patients with crocodile attack injuries. Not so common on the Clyde. Now here's an example of a patient. I'm going to resist the temptation of showing some of the more devastating injuries resulting from croc attacks, but this chap is a patient that we cared for who sustained his injury, a bite in the river, not by a croc, but by a hippopotamus. His leg actually is incidental to that story because his injury was on his bottom, and I'm not going to show you that, but I couldn't resist taking this picture of his prosthetic foot, a homemade artificial leg. Actually, his lower leg had been blown off in a landmine incident, and he fashioned his own artificial leg from melted down plastic containers and even carved himself a fairly creditable wooden foot. As well as crocodiles and rivers, the dangers are not confined there. Venomous snakes can also cause carnage. People fear the notorious black mamba, its venom causing paralysis and death within just a few short hours, depending on the dose, and yet easily correctable with anti-venom. But success is really dependent on getting to the hospital on time. I saw the death of an 8-year-old girl who was subjected to local medicine by the witch doctors, not brought to the hospital until she was virtually dead, in extremis. And when she died, we discovered that her brother had been taken by a crocodile in the river just a matter of weeks before. It's hard to understand or comprehend the tragedy for the family concerned. But look at this smiling, plucky wee lad who actually lost his hand. There's his amputated forearm as a result of a venomous snake bite. Now, it would really be remiss of me not to introduce another absolutely key member of the Chitokoloki scene. This is JR, Julie Rachel Elwood from Northern Ireland. Julie Rachel certainly kept me right when I was there. She's an incredibly versatile and talented person. Not only is she a midwife by background, looks after all maternity services, but oversees the rest of the hospital activity as well. Pretty much across the board. She's a capable anaesthetist, ultrasonographer, researcher, administrator, manager. And one of her particular skills and responsibilities there actually is to look after the specialty care of the babies and children who present with club foot, even operating on those who need tendon release procedures. Again, a remarkable and unparalleled skill set. Now I'm going to take you into the operating theatre in Chitokoloki, and it's not like this. This is what I was very accustomed to working in a modern academic centre in a city hospital in Glasgow. Chitokoloki is not quite so palatial. This is the theatre there, and here I am operating using a telescope. Normally that telescope would connect to a video camera, but unfortunately, being Africa, we had almost a fully complete set of kit, but not quite. The monitor is actually lying on the stack, which you can just see behind my head there. It's lying face down because we had no cable to connect the monitor to the camera. So there we are, using the time-honoured Admiral Lord Nelson approach to telescopic surgery. On a subsequent visit, thankfully we managed to get the monitor working, and here we are bringing for the first time fully functional minimal access video surgery to Chitokoloki. A great benefit actually for selected patients. That's Jenny at the head of the table. The others around there, you can see JR, taken by the novelty of this, taking a picture of the screen with her phone. And the others there are Kayambo and Dr. Mwansa. There's another view of Jenny pretending to be an anaesthetist and supervising the anaesthetised patient. But actually, the reality is better shown by this image, because this image shows what genuinely goes on. Notice the maintenance guys are never far away. Equipment failures are common. And occasionally, despite the fact that Chitokoloki has an amazing array of solar panels giving fantastic power, the power sometimes does go down. And in the middle of an operation like this, that can be a little challenging. We managed to complete this procedure using the light from a couple of iPhones. Chitokoloki gets quite a few visitors, and they're very well equipped to deal with and very hospitable, pardon me, towards visitors. This is one of them. This is a colleague of mine, a fellow called Kevin Kerrigan, on the left of the screen. He is from Spokane in Washington State, a very fine American surgeon with a huge experience in various mission settings, including parts of South America, Papua New Guinea, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and recently in the last couple of years, even in Iraq. It was a real privilege to work with and learn from Kevin. He came with his wife Leslie, and there we are operating with David with his usual smile in the background. One of the common procedures we do that I never ever did really in clinical practice in Scotland was caesarean section. There we are with Caitlin, with Lorraine in the background, with the happy outcome of a successful caesarean section. I've got a story about a caesarean section in the book somewhere which actually corresponds with one of the experiences I've had, which I've called the fright of my life. And, well, you have to buy the book to read about that. Just before I conclude, let me just show you the three old clinicians. Here we are. I couldn't resist this picture either. This is David and myself flanking the lady in the middle, who is Dr. Roz, Dr. Roz Jefferson. Roz spends about half her time now in Chitokoloki. She's a paediatric neurologist. She looks after the children when she's there. She's a wonderful cook and a hostess, and actually, generally speaking, she's a force of nature, demonstrating energy levels regardless of the time of day or night that can only be described as legendary. And she came into theatre that day to show us these homemade crutches. All of these folks feature in some way in the stories that we've assembled and that we tell in Controlled Chaos. Now, I was hoping that Jenny would be able to join us live tonight, but unfortunately she's on duty in the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle upon Tyne, where they've, if you've been watching the news, just had some desperate activity this week with 4 young people in their late teens all losing their lives with drug-related incidents, and some of them actually coming in under the care of Jenny and our colleagues in the RVI. But this is a picture of her in Chit, having extracted some foreign body that she carved from someone's foot. So anyway, right now what we've done is we've recorded a 7-minute video where she'll read a few excerpts from the chapters she contributed to Controlled Chaos. This is the picture we put on the back of the cover, showing the two of us in New Zealand. She worked in New Zealand for a year or so, a couple of years back. So Jenny, you went to Chitokoloke when you were a medical student. Tell us about your impressions when you arrived there.
My first impression was that it was quite overwhelming. So my friend Lindsay and I came back after our first day, and we just thought that was unbelievable. I felt like I'd seen every possible diagnosis that there is of tropical medicine and general surgery, and it had only been one day. We had been thrown right into the deep end with emergencies going on right, left and centre, and the staff there didn't really mind that we fell out of our depth, and they didn't really mind that we had never done most of the things that we were being asked to do before. They just, told us that we should get on with it. So it was quite overwhelming, would be my first impression.
How long did you spend there when you went for the first time?
So the first time I was there was a 6-week elective, so just over a month.
Now, you've written a good chunk of the book Controlled Chaos, and it would be good if you could maybe select a couple of excerpts and maybe just read them, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. I'll just read from part of one of my chapters. I've written, I love the atmosphere of community here in the hospital. Community essentially means absolutely no privacy. If you ask a patient a leading question such as, have you been doing your exercises? Or, do you drink much alcohol? The patient will always respond and tell you the answer you want to hear. The giveaway sign is that the rest of the 20 patients in the ward all crack up laughing when they hear the lies, indicating to you that things might not be as they seem. As we traipse from bed to bed down the long line of patients and then back up the other side, everyone's ears and eyes are on the patient who is in question. Not only other patients, but their caregivers too, who might be any family member from grandson to great auntie, and their dependents along with them, and of course any blue man, who was a cleaner, who may be passing by and helpfully edge into the conversation to translate. Everyone gives their tuppence worth, whether it is required or not, and the heckling makes me feel quite at home.
So you said that when you went there at first, you were suddenly just given all this extra responsibility. So how did you adapt to that? Tell us about, or maybe you've got something you can read to us about your experience of just being on your own and having to fend for yourself.
Yes, that happened more the second time I went than the first time, because I'd had already 1 year of experience of being a doctor, and so to everybody there that was plenty of experience, and I was kind of left to do things, especially the ward rounds, because everyone else who was there was a surgeon and they wanted to go to theatre. So I've got a little bit in my chapter about doing the ward round by myself, which I'll read. Thursday. I do not know how this happened, but I ended up on the ward round by myself. Dad said a quick hello to those in intensive care and then toddled off to theatre, and everyone else disappeared. I quite enjoy the banter on the ward round and making my own decisions. In this hospital, I find myself discharging patients, stopping antibiotics. People seem to be on cloxacillin for months at a time, and in my opinion, that is asking for antibiotic resistance. Increasing painkillers, maybe I'm too soft. And for any that are too hard to deal with, I say, you need to go to theatre and see Dr. Galloway Senior. So a new patient was admitted with a leg wound. None of the nursing staff were enthusiastic about undoing his dirty bandage. So I told myself, don't be proud, Jenny, this is a job for you. You can imagine my horror as a large pus-filled wound was exposed, which was absolutely crawling with maggots. I could not have retreated from that bedside any faster. Maybe not a job for me after all. The smell was awful. These were nice little sterile maggots like you get in Britain to help the wounds heal. These were massive, fat, yellow, flesh-eating maggots that were falling out of the bed and onto the floor, and I immediately regretted my choice of flip-flops that day. I'm still itching at the memory.
Yeah, very good. What is the the last little section you're going to read to us. What's that about?
This one is about when I was asked to help in theatre. The surgeons that I worked with were very keen, like Dr. McAdam was very keen that I should get a lot of experience, even though I wasn't particularly enthusiastic myself necessarily all the time. And I quite enjoyed it, but I also just quite often felt terrified. So I've got a little bit in the book that I'll read about when I was asked to help in theatre. I had the opportunity today to close an abdomen after a major operation. This is meant to be the easy bit. My problem was that I developed a sore back because the operating table here slowly sinks down during the operation. It can be elevated by pumping a foot pedal, but it slowly and imperceptibly sinks down again so that before you know it, you're bent in the middle, deep in concentration, trying to fiddle about with tiny instruments and needles. It's honestly so difficult. Dad sutures big wounds in no time, and I fiddle around for ages just trying to get my needle onto the needle holder, which to me looks just like every other instrument on the tray. Moansa was also saying that I keep putting the needle in too deep. She wanted me to go along the line of the wound, just under the surface of the skin, and if I dared venture into the subcutaneous tissue, she would say, "Too big." We are talking in millimeters here. Absolutely no mercy for my shaky hands and achy back.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Jen. That was excellent. So have you been able to share the book a little bit with some of your friends and colleagues?
Yeah, so I was working in Glasgow when the book came out, and a lot of my colleagues heard about it, and a few bought some copies. Even had one of my friends who's a healthcare assistant, her best friend sent me a message on Instagram and said she wants to read it. So yeah, there's been quite a lot of interest. Some of my school friends have been reading it as well, and I'm getting positive feedback, so that's good.
Well, it's good that you were able to record this, because we appreciate that as this is live streamed, you will be in the depths of the emergency department in the Royal Victoria Hospital, all being well, and fending off some of the badness there. But thanks very much for reading these excerpts and for adding your recommendation to the book, and I hope that it adds a little bit of extra interest to those that might be contemplating either buying the book to help Chūtōka Loki, because after all the proceeds will go directly to the work of the Mission Hospital there. But good to have you involved in this tonight, so thanks very much.